Well, hello everybody. It's the last show for the year, and I'm welcoming back three very distinguished guests. One who's not with us yet, but welcome back, Peter Brooks,
Hi, Joanna. Thank
colleague
you.
and friend. Yeah, and I miss you in Cape Town, mate. Richard de Kok,
Hey.
my other son. Welcome back.
Definitely.
And then David Cannon, who seems to be.
I think we've got an echo on, Johan.
Okay on my side, I think.
I think I'm clear. I'm on. Sorry.
And I got a message from David. He's joining as we speak.
Okay.
I've got my headphones on.
Okay. Is it better now?
Fine for me.
Peter?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I also just got a message from Dave saying he's on his way. Okay. Awesome. So while we're waiting for David to join us, maybe just a little bit of background to.
Sorry, are you hearing a feedback delayed a bit?
No,
not at all.
Okay, I'll log off and rejoin.
Okay. So.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Let me leave.
The beauty of modern technology. What a time to be alive.
Yeah, fun and games for the last show of the year. Anyway, so Peter, are you back?
No, he's just gone.
No, he's
He'll be
just
joining
gone.
shortly.
Okay, so the conversation started with me and Richard talking about, I can't remember what.
Transcending best practices.
It was before that. No,
it was before that. You're right.
And then we said,
but, it was the DevOps and ITIL. The ITIL.
Okay. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we said, but surely we should. What's beyond? What's beyond all of these best practices? And then myself and Richard tried to have a stab at it, and it didn't work. So
what?
I called in some help. No, Richard, we still haven't gotten answers. So
you didn't define at the beginning of the session what a successful outcome would be, Johan. So that's now relative, isn't it? I wanted to stay on the show, so it's great success from my side.
Yeah, it makes me think of consultants. Yeah, a good outcome for many consultants is how long they can stay on site, but that's not always the model choice. In fact, it's never the model choice.
Getting away as soon as possible is one of the best, I think.
Yeah.
Oh dear!
Absolutely.
I remember one session with a financial organization that I really wanted to leave shortly after arriving. Anyway, that's another point.
Hi,
David.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey, David.
Or afternoon.
Okay. Sorry, not everybody's going to get that, but those who needed to get that did get it. And now he holds himself oblivious.
I didn't even hear it.
No, I said, agter ons kom ook in die kraal.
There you go. That's yeah. I am very, very behind, but here we are. The cows will come home, as they say.
So, for Richard's benefit, let me define then a successful outcome. Okay. So we're not here to debate whether best practice is a good or a bad thing. Yeah. There's clearly merit in it. That's why it exists. But I think we can all agree that it's not enough. So how do we go beyond? Yes, but the book whose best practice and therefore some holy scripture says you must, which incidentally it doesn't. Where do we go from here? So let's start with IT. I think it's an easy place to actually kick off the conversation, and then we can go to business from there.
Just
And now
start having
everybody's
discussion.
quiet.
Just start having discussions with business
All
more.
right. No, so I'll kick off with a comment. I think we often forget how new IT is, and that what we call best practice is really just what we've learned from a bunch of experimentation that's been going on. We didn't see it as experimentation because it was it was sold to us as a solution. But in fact, when we implement something for the first time, and we have to try and manage that, you really are in an experimental stage. And the IT industry is only a few decades old. It's not centuries old like other professions. So when we talk about best practice, what we're really talking about is, hey, in this new and growing and very exciting area, there are some things that some people have learned that work. And I hate that we call it best practice. That's a very misleading term. It is practice that has worked. And it's practice that has probably worked in more than one organization. In fact, we know it's worked in more than one organization. So it's probably likely to have some value in it for you. But that, it's still
Best so far.
Best so far, exactly. But we're nowhere near maturity as an industry at this point. And everything we do, yes, I mean, some of it is older than others, and some of it we have more of a proven way of working with it than others. But that doesn't mean that proven way of working in that scenario is going to work in all scenarios. So it may have been best in what we were trying to do at that time. But you're going to have to experiment. Even with this thing that we call best, is still an input to an ongoing growth and maturity. In fact, we can't even talk about maturity because it's changing too much, right? So this ongoing change, and so for me, best practice at best is an input. It's something to consider, something to think about as you consider your next course of action moving forward.
But you talk about experiment, and I understand what you mean by it. We all know what experiment means, but one of my concerns, and it's less of my concern now, it was my concern 20 years ago, was that an awful lot of stuff that came out of best practice was sort of best prejudice. It was what kind of people thought was, good. And, sometimes cause and effect are not so connected. So you do something and everything goes well. Maybe what you did was connected, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it just went well because it was a good time. And there haven't really been any rigorous, or not many rigorous scientific investigations. Is this really what is doing it? As we know, any intervention, if you invent some complete nonsense, based on horoscopes or something, and go to an organization and say, look, chaps, this is what we've got to do, you'll see an improvement because at least you're talking to them, something's happening. So the question is, you could go to a whole lot of companies with horoscopes and a whole lot of companies with best practice and see which done better, but you've got to be quite brave to do that because it might be the wrong way around.
So this is quite a stab at me, Peter, with my love of Jung and synchronicity, eh?
Speaking of which, I got my
horoscopes
book
something
today,
quite different.
Yeah, but you know how Jung tested synchronicity was with horoscopes.
If they work, but we know they always work. I mean, if you decide that you're going to be Gemini for the month, it will tell you that you're Gemini, whatever you are. I mean, I've enjoyed reading horoscopes just to see if it would be possible for it not to apply to me. And you look through all of the things. Now, could this actually not be me? And very seldom do you find that that's possible.
Yeah.
So it is the same point you're making as I am, really. How do you know that what you've done is what's caused the effect rather than other factors that are related to it? And we don't really know that with best practice.
Yeah, but that's not entirely true because much of what we know is in the books. We know there's some result because lots of people say it works for them. Now, okay, you can argue that it works for them because they want it to work for them. But the point is, it still worked for them. Yeah.
Yes. And so I got to be very careful here, because we also disregard best practice at our peril. On the one hand, it's not absolute truth. It's the result of experimentation. And I think in some cases, just the fact that we've got people talking to each other is making the difference. What they talk to each other about, yeah, I understand that. But at the same time, for example, let's look at a so-called best practice of capacity management. And let's look at workload modeling. Now, when you speak to someone who manages a server, workload modeling is taking your last 3 years' performance and projecting it into the future. That's workload forecasting. But actually, the best practice is to say, understand what it is that your user is doing, understand what demand that places on the resources that they're using, and then understand how that demand will change over time based on a number of factors around it. Now, many organizations say, well, that's too much effort, so we're not going to do that. And anyway, the tools are going to do it for us, which they don't, by the way. And so that practice of workload portfolios, workload managing, workload forecasting has become fairly disregarded in many organizations. And then they move to the cloud. And suddenly, usage spirals, and, we didn't notice it before, but now you're paying for every single thing you do. Suddenly it becomes very noticeable. Whoa, what do we do about this? We go back to ITIL version 1 to deal with that particular issue. Yeah, I'm being a little sarcastic. So, it's a balance. It's like, so and I'm sort of in the middle between this. On the one hand, don't take it too seriously. On the other hand, don't neglect it either.
I know a guy a real smart, really good looking guy. He came up with a good analogy about a car and how you can apply best practice in the following way. So it's this natural fit you find. So you've got books that have been written that you have to read to understand how the roads work, right? The basic rules of the road, and how to drive the car, and the 7-point, 8-point, 300-point check that you have to do, whatever it might be. The rules change. But you read this thing like you would read any best practice book. You study it, you go and you write a test on it. You get this thing called a learner's license. Great, now you got this learner's license. I know this worked, well, this was how it worked back in South Africa when I got my license, but I know it works a little differently elsewhere. But that means you can now drive on the road with supervision, but you've passed the theoretical part of that. And for me, that's like going and doing any best practice book, reading, studying, and then going and actually writing a certification and exam. When you're riding around with the supervisor, which now we don't typically get in practice because we're now just thrown into the road with all the oncoming traffic and all of that, and you're driving around like this, trying to think of looking through the book to see what do I do here, what do I do here. What happens is over time you kind of find this weird natural balance. So the first point is you're really engaged in what you're doing, because now we're talking life and death, so you can't mess around with best practice. That best practice was written based on significant research, significant practice. So when you look at driver's license material, that's pretty well researched, well grounded theory that you're sort of digesting, right? It's not near as abstract or as opinion bias that some best practice may be. It's very factual, like it's been studied, this is why we do this or that. Anyway, point being, over time, you no longer follow all those rules in that book. You disregard a lot of them. You just pick up this natural style. In fact, you probably go far beyond what that book and that learning you had was, because you interpret the road and the physical stuff around you in a way that is appropriate to you. For some people who don't and actually pick up bad practices, they get fines, they get indicators that it's time to go back and learn a bit more or refresh yourself perhaps. The point I'm trying to make is that I always try and see best practice as exactly as you said, David, exactly as you were saying, Peter. It's like it's input and it's practice, and mental engagement. And if you're seeing results that you want, then you're doing it. Do we need to take it beyond that? I don't really know. As long as you're seeing the results you're wanting, orchestrating that across a whole organization, yeah, maybe that's a little bit more of a complex paradigm to take on. But just at an individual or a team-based perspective, that's really what you do to try and get better at any form of best practice.
So you're really saying the point about unconscious competence. You know, when you start off, you're consciously incompetent, then you learn the rules and you really can't do it, but you now are more aware of the fact that you can't do it. And then as you get experience, practice, you become, you start believing you're competent. And with good practice, then in this case, not good practice, but practicing well. In practicing well, you then start to develop habits that seem to lead in the right direction. And then you're considered an expert. And if the ideas that tend to lead in the right direction have been kicked off by previous people's experience, you're more likely to make fewer errors. So it's sort of an initial guidance to point you in the right direction as you gather your experience. But the experience is really what does it. And you can't teach experience.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. It'll work provided you're trying to do more or less the same thing as the people who created the best practice in the first place, right? But if you're not, if you're trying to do something different or new, it may or may not work. We don't know yet.
One point in defense to where it might not apply is that, for example, if the rules suddenly radically change, right? Or that the best practice itself wasn't that best practice, because we're assuming when we read best practice that it's viewed as a de facto standard in an industry. But every book I've got behind me and every book in my Kindle and every book you see is a form of good practice that someone has written down. This has really worked for me. This is great. And then you digest all this content. I think the next problem that we typically face, well, I faced on my journey with trying to get better at things, is you need to go beyond what one book says. You need to educate yourself in many books to get a consensus of things as a starting point. Because if you're only focusing on one best practice, so pick DevOps as a perfect example. DevOps as a practice, it's still got a lot of development going on behind it. There's lots of new practices coming out with it, which is great. We're getting great minds getting together at these conferences and coming up with ways to address common problems that they're experiencing. You can't just read a DevOps book and not go and understand the theory of constraints by Eli Golding, and you can't go and not understand manufacturing and lean and all those things. You can't short circuit those years of learning of those disciplines by just reading a DevOps book or two. Like, you have to immerse yourself in understanding lean, manufacturing, and so you have to constantly build up your knowledge base and play with it and experiment with it. It's not a case of best practice equals success. You have to keep immersing yourself in the knowledge pool and growing from there.
You're trying to integrate these different sources, is what you're saying, because no source is unique, and you need to integrate them. And this is something that they come across in science as well, that various scientific disciplines end up going down particular specialized rabbit holes. And that can be very productive. But what really is productive is every now and again, when there's, as Kun was putting it, there's a paradigm shift, and you have cross-discipline interactions. So people who've been concentrating on physics can learn from what mathematicians will be doing, and they can both learn from evolution. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it.
From the butterfly collection.
So the question is how to try and of course what you're saying happens for each individual person. So if you have a team of 5 people who've all got that experience that they've built up over years, have integrated it, you've got 5 different opinions about most things, because they will have integrated them in different, they're all correct, they're all based on things, but a different integration will give a different result. So you're back in saying, well, we need to get some gurus, or maybe just the one. Because you're saying you can't rely on best practice. You can't rely on a group of experts, because they'll disagree. So maybe you should just pin your faith on the chosen one.
Okay, so let me just leave 2 or 3 things in that will throw it into the conversation. I quite often say to people that best practice is the starting point. It's not the destination. We also know that Dave Snowden says that in the simple domain, best practice works well. And then Ivan McFarlane's intelligent disobedience, I love.
Mhm.
And what else? What else can we throw into? And David Anderson, who said, any practice done well will yield results. And if you do it badly, it won't work. Yeah. So,
but that's magical thinking, that one.
No, I mean,
if you follow the spell exactly, you're okay. If you misspell one of the words, or you say it too quickly, or it's the wrong time of the month, it doesn't work. Yeah.
But the point, though, is that whether you use COVID or ITIL or DevOps or you're going to get value from all of this stuff. But the question is, what's the next step?
That goes to David's point he was making a minute ago about the emergent practices.
Yeah, these discussions are hugely valuable and hugely important. We have to be careful, though, that we do not leave people without hope.
You want to give them hope that's got some grounds. Foolish hope that if you follow the spells correctly, it doesn't matter what the spell is, you'll be okay, is perhaps not quite the hope to pin people's expectations.
No, you're actually, some of the stuff must be proven and must work. I'm going to go back to that incredibly handsome and smart gentleman's example of cars.
So for those of you who don't know, Richard was talking about himself, okay?
Past tense, though. I'm not the same person as I was when we had our meeting the last time. I've grown since then.
There are a couple of industries where best practice evolves incredibly quickly and with an incredible amount of authority. Driving is one of them. Aircraft safety is another one of them. When you talk about best practice in aircraft safety, you're not talking about some great ideas that you may choose to implement or not implement. The reason that best practice has come about is because people have died in some catastrophic incident. And what we learned from that incident has now been applied as a practice. But it's more than a best practice. In many cases, it becomes legislation. And the same is true in driving.
And the medical field.
And the medical field. The reason why we have those books to read when we go and study for our license, every one of those rules has a story behind it.
All rules do.
Yeah. And so the difference, I think, in IT is that it takes a lot longer and the results are very often not as obvious of the missteps. And so, is this the case that best practice doesn't work? No, it does. Sorry.
I think one misstep is, and I think you put your finger on exactly what it is, and it goes back to what Richard was talking about integration, that if you want good results, you do need to have background in different areas, and you need to integrate them and use more than just one and understand how they work together.
Correct.
And so you need cross-domain fertilization where different things help others. Now, what's frustrated me for years about just what you were talking about is the way in which they can crack the problem completely in one domain and completely and utterly ignore it in all the others. And aircraft safety is exactly that. If you want an airplane to fly, you use reliable programming, you use ADA. And there's a way you do it, there's a way you develop it, and it is reliable, it's safe, you can prove it mathematically that it works. And the rest of IT uses this utter rubbish that is completely unprovable, that is a known mess, that crashes all the time, that gives us jobs. Why?
Job creation, mate, it's job creation.
But it frustrates me. I mean, if if banks, for example, really cared about losing lots of money, which they don't, because after all, the bankers in charge still get their payout, however much the bank crashes. In fact, if they have a really good crash, they could then get a job in another bank because they've got good experience, or you were able to see a crash. This is true. I know someone who did exactly that, nice promotion to another bank because you now know about crashes. Brilliant. Now, that means that they are not really interested in having reliable systems. But if they were, they'd go to the airplanes and they'd say, get this ADA stuff.
Well,
we don't care about if you know Java or something. If you want to work on this, you learn ADA and you do it the right way and we'll prove it and it'll work. And then they would actually have reliable systems that didn't crash, but they can't be bothered. And people in IT talk about best practice. Oh, yeah, well, you do this and you do that. But if you have any old bit of stuff you can string together, Java, JavaScript, or anything like that, just fling it at it. If it suits you, if people like it, why bother? I mean, why do we give advice to people about everything? But the crucial bit that hold it all together, we say, well, if you can wing it, just go for it. I mean, to me, it's
guys. I just need to. Okay, Stephanus talks about the difference between standard practice and best practice. I don't quite a standard practice environment until it's proven to work. The problem, though, Stephen, is that the context. Yeah, no, context is the problem. Context is king.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we work in an environment where it's not like the medical field. You work with a human body, and human bodies works like this.
Well, human body is still a big unknown in the medical field.
Well, but still,
they don't all work the same.
Neural surgery as a specialism is like there's a lot of highly educated guesswork still in that space, right? I mean, it's
but even there, so this is the tightrope we walk. It's a tightrope between the proven and known and that which we don't know. And I think in IT we have a lot more unknown than many other fields because we're so new and because we're innovating so much. But let's not forget that there are some definitive knowns. If stuff breaks, you have to be able to detect it and fix it. That's not in dispute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so here's where, David, I've always rallied behind your message of hope, and I believe in it, and it's a very, very important, very important lesson. It is a very important lesson that I learned from you, and I keep in mind. But when I take a harsh look at things, if you've got someone who gets their driver's license and doesn't give a rat's ass about the rules of the road, he's just that way inclined, doesn't care. It's like, I want to just get there and sod it, I'm just going to do it. And they kind of just do their own thing the way they want because they want to whatever, right? So I think the big challenge we have is the people element. And because this is an over discussed point as well. The people, right? It is the element. I think the big challenge is, at the end of the day, you can bring the greatest minds, the greatest practitioners, the greatest everything to a problem. But if you've got a CEO of an organization who's just in it to make the money, if you've got someone who's managing a team just to try and get a promotion to another area, that dynamic, I think, is also an important factor in what makes best practice work or not. And that can't be overlooked and is very tragically outside of the control of the people who are really wanting to make the difference and make things work.
Yeah, I'm with you. And back to the point of, in those cases, I mean, the truth will out. Those people do get caught out. It takes longer. It takes longer.
I've seen, I can't point to particular examples for obvious reasons, but I've seen organizations that the boards are continually just milk. Each new board that comes in, it's this repetitive cycle of corruption and there are unfortunately toxic environments that they're just stuck with that until someone puts their foot down and fixes the problem.
But now we're on another problem. You're really talking about now governance, and governance is a vital. And we've now, I mean, ITIL 4 fortunately now has understood that if you don't start from the top with governance and you start from the bottom, however good anything is, it will eventually be killed politically. And that's correct. You've got to do it from governance downwards and govern organizations. And as long as organizations are not forced to be governed properly, and we've now got a governance standard that says what that means, you can forget about having progress. Sometimes you're lucky where an organization happens to behave well, happens to have a good corporate culture, and you're off. But when it's a mess, really, it's better not to join, better to leave them alone, because you can't do anything.
Quickly mention something, David, before you go on. Mervyn King, he said he was in the States, and there was a senator that came up to him and said, "Yeah, Judge King, it's so good to meet you. You know, when we debated Sarbanes-Oxley, your name was mentioned. I can't remember how many times." And his response was, "Just a pity you didn't understand what I meant." So
yeah, get rid of it.
He says that you cannot legislate honesty. So it actually comes back to, Richard, to this human element, this issue of ethics and morals, and the fact that not everybody wants to make a difference and want to be a good person.
So I want to come back to the point where I was headed, which is that best practice is often determined or defined by things we do so the bad stuff doesn't happen. It's not defined as the stuff we should do because it's good. I would love for people to think that way.
Yeah, but it isn't.
But generally, best practice is what we do to avoid getting into trouble. Why do we follow the rules in the license manual that Richard was referring to? It's not because we're good people and we really want to follow traffic laws. It's because if we don't, there are consequences to this, and we want to avoid those consequences. That being said, of course, I take your point, Richard. I nearly failed my driving test here when I got to Texas, because one of the questions was, how many feet do you stop from a railway crossing? Honestly, I still don't know. I had to learn it, but I've forgotten it, because isn't that like there are lines, and if there are not lines, you stay away, right?
Well, that
park on a railway crossing.
It reminds me of a brief joke. A guy taking is the driver instructions with the person, and they get on this road and he's driving along, and then there's this old lady and a little boy walking along the road, and the driving instructor says to him, "Right, now let's just imagine for a second they jump out in front of the road. What do you hit?" And the guy's he's thinking for a minute, and then he says, "Oh, well, the old lady's doesn't have much time left, so maybe her, because the other one's got his life, ahead of him." And the driver instructor's like, "The brake, Tom. You hit the brake."
But that's an interesting thing you say there. Actually, David, you're talking about doing things because you're not doing the right thing. You're trying to avoid the accident. Well, I was talking about this the other day. It was an idea that came to me a while, and at the ITSMF conference, I spoke about it. And I was, in a way, trying to think about what we're talking about today, how to go beyond best practice. And I was thinking back to Aristotelian ethics and doing the right thing, and virtue doing the right thing. And I was thinking, what do you really want in an organization? As you say, you can't legislate from it. What you want is the board of governors, the governing body, to decide consciously that they are going to follow certain virtues. Now, what virtue you decide and how the virtue works is another completely different question. But then what you try to do as a governing body is to ensure a flow of virtue through your organization, so the culture becomes aligned to your ideas of virtue. So in the case of services, the flow of virtue is partly there already. Some of the things we think about that are not breaking things are, how do we make sure the customer gets value? What is value? Concentrating on a service mindset. Those are all sort of beginnings, I think, of setting up a flow of virtue. And if you can think of where do we need to set these flows of virtue? How do we, and you were talking again, Richard, about integrating and getting experience. How do you get your ideas about what is a virtuous way to behave when this happens, like a major incident or a thing or whatever it is? if you could start getting those as Aristotelian virtues, a virtuous person, when everything falls apart, does not panic. I mean, I'm just inventing silly things, but the idea of being able to communicate to people, not this is the rule, or you do that to avoid things, but these are the ways in which wise people operate, because that's what experts are trying to get. And if best practice just says you do X, now Y, then it's not imbuing you with the idea of how you come about deciding the sort of approach you should take. And I agree, something like Synefin is another way of saying that in different circumstances you do different things. But I'm thinking of a more general, as I say, how does an organization begin to instill virtues in its structure as a flow through it?
Right. So part of the reason why there are now guiding principles, and I know that people are going to get fixated on what those guiding principles are. The real issue is that you should have guiding principles.
They did it in the Agile Manifesto for sure, almost detrimentally.
Yeah. And so, I think in the digital and IT strategy book, Richard and I were very careful to say there are other guiding principles that you may want to consider, right? But interesting to the point, you mentioned value, Peter, and that's so important. I wish that value was what drove most of us in our industry. If it was, then we would have a lot more service portfolios out there.
Absolutely.
There's no mistake in my mind that the most commonly and well-practiced disciplines, let's not call them best practice, is incident, problem, and change management, supported by a subset of knowledge management related to knowledge articles, related to how you fix stuff when it breaks. It's a very small subset of knowledge management, by the way, but it seems to have become the be-all and end-all of everything. And why is this? Because people are not as focused on value, they're focused on staying out of trouble.
Absolutely.
And this is, unfortunately, I think this is, how do we make that shift towards an organization that operates, and a profession, because that's what we are, that operates on more of that higher order thinking, that value-based thinking.
There's a bit that needs filling in, because I was writing, when I wrote that book about adopting service governance, I was talking about just what you're saying about having the portfolio of services important, and understanding for each service, from the point of view of the governing body, the ratio between value and cost. If you're getting more value than you're getting cost, it's good. If you're getting less value than cost, it's bad. And I think that is a kind of virtuous guidance, in that you are looking and understanding value is the key driver of your service compared to what it costs you to get that value. The problem is I realize it's an unfinished thought, because it assumes you could make a ratio between two things that have got different units. What is the unit of value? It's not actually money. What is the unit of cost? It's not actually money either. Cost is effort, cost is time, cost is all sorts of things. So you need to, I think there's an area of study that it would be worth doing, to think about, for practical organizations, how would you, I mean, it's sort of vague, roughly, approximately what you mean by ratio of value to cost. How do you transform that into something real that you can show a board and say, this service is doing so well because this is the value and that's cost?
I did an exercise this year. I sat down actually with Mark Bradley, and we were talking about value, and we were asking this exact question: how do you calculate that ratio? And I said, well, hold on. We talk about value all the time in our personal lives. You go out to eat and you say, well, that was good value for money. What do you mean? There's no financial return on you going to eat out unless you close the business deal there, or whatever. And so what I did is we created this very simple table, exactly as you've got it, with the outcomes on the one side, the things that are valuable to us on the one side, and they were financial and non-financial. And on the other side, we put down all the things that you have to invest in. And the interesting question was this: is like, if your IT department had to look at all of its budget and all of its business cases, which side of the table are they on? And 99% of them are on the side of the table of investment. So think about what is investment. Break fix is investment. It's not value. right? Because if something was valuable, it wouldn't break in the first place, right? It's like, so break fix is investment. It costs you money. Training, investment, costs you money. People, investment, they cost you money to train them, skill them.
It's all the simple, measurable stuff. All
that. Where is IT spending most of its attention? It's on that side. It's the tools that we're buying are all based on things that yield something on the investment side. It's break fix, it's training, it's moving to the cloud, it's improving service performance. That's all investment, right? Very few business cases that I've seen deal with anything that's on the other side of that table. So
I think the ground's shifting a bit, though, Dave, to be fair as well, though. I think looking at organizations, not because of COVID, so not using that as the driver here, but I think over the last 3-4 years, there's been a bit more of a shift on more business focus and business delivery from what I've seen. But I don't know if you've seen the same kind of focus.
I agree with you, but I think what's happening there is that a lot of the initiatives are being driven out of business units.
You're completely correct on that. Yeah, and absolutely.
Business units are definitely focused on value.
And that's a good
business cases of those innovations and that technology investment that's coming out of the business unit. All of those business cases are focused on the other side of the table. They're not looking at service performance. They're not looking at break fix. They're not looking at what they're looking at is new markets, new products, new services, more efficiency. Right?
Well, I think that's just Peter. You first.
No, sorry. I was just thinking, I agree, David, completely with that analysis. And I agree there's the imbalance. And I think that there is a way to square the circle. There is a commonality between the two sides. And it was discovered by Epicurus. And Epicurus' notion was that what you're trying to achieve is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, paying money to remove pain is trying to remove pain. So break fix is dealing with a negative happiness pain. Getting a great result of having market growth, lots of happy customers is happiness. Happiness and pain can be related to each other. If something's going badly, you've got more pain than happiness. If it's going well, you've got more happiness than pain. Now, I know this is hand waving, but those are actually units that you can ascribe to any piece of value or any piece of cost, because lots of money is more painful than a little bit.
Agreed. But
David, can I quickly just remind you of something?
Yes.
You were on a webinar, and one of the people said to you, so how do you measure customer value in IT? And you gave them a very short answer. You can't.
No, you can't. You can't. I agree with that.
Yeah.
The customer measures it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a value is at the end of the chain. It's not at the beginning of the chain. And so what we've done.
Or after the chain, later on.
After the chain, exactly what you achieve. What we've done in organizations is we've separated those two components. We've put a wall between them. And we said, okay, you focus on doing all of the stuff on the break fix and the pain side of the column, right? And we'll focus on doing all the happiness side of the column. And then over time, the people on the pain side of the column think, I've got to feel happier. So let me turn it into a value-based business. It's not value, it's still investment. Okay, our payback period for this new piece of technology is going to be 10 months. Really? Is that making everybody happy? No, it's just reducing the pain a little bit.
Yes, absolutely.
I think something we'll probably start to see coming back to the not that this is an off topic, but bringing it back home to transcending the best practice. So there is a researcher named Joe Peppard from MIT that has done a significant amount of research, and there's other research out there around how organizations are doing away with their entire IT function. And we've seen them here in the UK. There are organizations that do not have an IT function. Big organizations that big energy companies that have a lot of legacy IT are getting rid of their IT function. They're building technology into the business. So business will lead the technology, and
Just
the
like
whole thing.
electricity. There used to be electricity departments. Nobody needs them anymore. With a
Absolutely.
short-term technology, they needed a department to handle it, then they got rid of it. I agree, absolutely.
So
well, I would love to see how an energy company integrates its transformation and generation and distribution. Sorry. Okay.
Richard, continue because you're halfway through a thought there.
Yeah, I was trying to catch up on what David was saying. Like, so anyway, the point that I think the big shift there is that once we remove a lot of the fat in that we have, you know, IT, I think as a function has got a lot of bloated fat in it, right, in terms of where focus is, etc. The moment
it's also, I think, a priesthood. What you're saying is fat. The IT is still a priesthood, and that's the problem. That they're the priests that look after it, and so they can be fat because they could always use the mafia defense. And I remember David saying years ago, if you don't do this, if you don't pay that money, then you're going to suffer.
Absolutely,
things won't work.
So we've got businesses now using platform teams, all part of the business and everything else, delivering technology. Now, the shift that happens now is that we're no longer focusing on delivering technical services. We are all grouped and structured against service lines that end customers are actually, you know, receiving and digesting. And I mean, everyone always looks to Netflix and Spotify and these companies that have absolutely shaken how, you know, best practice gets done in many ways. And I think the reason why they've been in a lot of forefront thinkings come out from them is because they've had to. Here's the point. Best practice is great, but when you are in hot boiling water and you're burning and you're very sore, you look at the war, you look at the things people have gone through and how the things they've had to do to get themselves out of really, really bad situations. Human innovation and intervention sort of takes hold, and you come up with a way. You make a plan, you find a way, and I think that's I think when you're at the boiling point with a customer facing service, and you don't have this huge big other organization to deal with to get things done. It's all on you. You're the accountable team. If this service fails and we lose revenue in the organization because the service has failed, everyone in that line of value is going to get a massive hiding for it. And because if we're structured in that way and we're delivering directly to a customer and the feedback we're getting from our customers is directly related to that service and to that team as individuals, suddenly all this fluff around best practice burns away like wildfire, because we are now focusing on actually fixing a problem that a customer's got right now. And by Jones, we're going to burn trying to get it done, and we're going to make sure that we don't do that mistake again. And in fact, we're going to go beyond that. We're going to try and find out how we prevent this from ever happening again. And you look at Netflix, who when their internet or their cloud service provider went down, they didn't. And it was there's a big write-up on it because they were the only ones who'd architected themselves to avoid a major outage like that. And I'm like, why doesn't everyone do that? Because it's an obvious thing, isn't it? But people way back in back office and the other side of the continent in the IT department, you know, they don't realize that that's actually a scenario. So the more we can
throw a finish, and then I want to throw a spanner into the works.
That's what I meant when I said what could possibly go wrong.
Yes.
What went wrong? Yeah.
I think the moment we're focusing directly on the customer and everyone is involved and right up against the shopping window and all on the front desk trying to support that customer, I think that's when that best practice concept, it's like great for learning, great for finding your feet, but then you're there and you're burning and you're figuring out how to deal with that. That's where people need to get to. If you're comfortable in the back office, learning, just continually absorbing and getting certificates on best practice, and there's, I don't mean disrespect by that, but there are people out there doing that, and they're very smart people, but, you know, are they making massive impact on our customers' lives? maybe not, because they're so far back in this thing called the IT division, not actually, point made. I'll stop there before I carry on waffling.
Okay.
Well, in one way, cloud
David?
is good that way because it's removing all that infrastructure stuff,
Yes.
putting it somewhere else. So, and that's why, as David was saying earlier, people start getting burnt because all the actual real dynamics are coming out when they were hidden in all the mess behind before. Yep. Sorry, you were going to come with your spanner.
Yeah, so here's the thing, David, you sort of mentioned it earlier, that much of best practice is about control. And this delusion that we have, by introducing more and more control, we will make a more stable environment, where the environment, the system that we operate in, is by nature unstable. Yeah. And then we rely on people that's further and further removed from the work being done to make decisions based on, quite honestly, stupid controls.
But that's just life. We all fear the void. We all try to pretend that everything's under control. That's how we live our everyday life. We are minutes away from disaster all the time. So it's just natural that we do that. We try. It is a way of whistling in the dark that we do the control. And the only way you can get past that is to be able to relax and accept the void, accept the disaster, and stop trying to control things that you can't. But the illusion is completely normal and natural. And the more dangerous and horrible things are, the more you try and control them.
I get that, Peter. The issue that I'm trying to get to is that you sort of, and one of my bugbears is in modern education, classical education is not part of it anymore. Yeah. Our children are not learned to think, to debate, to have different opinions, to weigh decisions, and all of that stuff comes from the classics. Yeah. Can't we transcend best practice by just teaching people some?
Well, I know, David, you want to say something, and I'm jumping in, but I don't know if you want to.
No, carry on.
I think so. A lot of David Anderson's work that I've really, I mean, I've gone through a lot of best practices, and I've got a lot of admiration for the work that he's doing, because he's talking about, and Peter's mentioned this before, but I'm going to bring up evolutionary change. And I don't even know if you remember, Peter, but you'd mentioned evolution's not exactly it's uncontrolled, right?
It's not progressive.
It's not progressive. But that debate aside, I think the point being that we need control's a good thing, but we often do it at the detriment of being flexible enough to accept that we live in dynamic worlds. And so you could put a whole bunch of rules in place, and you could be customer facing right in the front office and put these stringent rules in place, but you've got a competitor down the road who's found a way to get things done around a rule, but because of your rule you put in place now, you can't compete with them. And there's subtle things, right? In the whole user experience when you're engaged with that organization versus this one, that rule or those 3 rules or whatever else have an impact. And so people just gravitate to wanting to use the other competitor more than you. You need a way to continually receive feedback. I mean, this speaks to basic stuff, and maybe that's all it takes. Getting that basic feedback and making sure that you're receptive to what's going on around you, and open-minded to the fact that sometimes your rules need to shift and change a little bit in order for you to remain relevant, and David's done a lot of good work around that I've got tremendous respect for with Kanban, and he calls it an alternative approach to agile, where it's a far more natural growth experience than a rigid best.
So, but looser control is better, just as they find in Japan that and other places, that if you want to withstand earthquakes, building a wooden structure is more reliable than building a steel one. But either way, you're still trying to control something that is essentially uncontrollable, and that's the issue. And I think that what you put your finger on is that as a whole, humanity is still relying on almost everywhere some kind of rule-based structure, and rules don't actually hack it. The way nature does it, the way our hearts do it, is using chaos, not chaos in the way that Sinofen means it, as being a kind of everything not working, but proper chaos, mathematical chaos, fractal chaos. Our heart is a fractal device. The cells do not follow any sort of order. They basically fire when they feel like it. So, and the reason that our heart works is that these things fire together in a fractal way. So they depend on very complex local relationships with each other. And that's how we can walk upstairs with our heart rate constantly changing from the bottom of the stairs to the top of the stairs. We don't have to change gear. If it was a human machine, you'd have to change gear halfway up the stairs. Our hearts naturally move from the other, and that's because they are chaotic. And the way the chaos is controlled is the vagus nerve is what's called a strange attractor. And it just puts little impulses in saying, we need a bit more Fagamanji here. And it just puts a few more spikes. And the fractal engine starts to move into that direction. We need to go a bit slower. It just gives us so the vagus nerve controls this whole chaotic mess by just giving it little impulses at the right place in the right time. And when you're looking at something like an organization, that's how you actually genuinely need to control it. And that's how they are controlled. You could see with the pandemic, all sorts of organizations started changing, behaving differently, not because the managers or the governors or anybody else changed the rules, but because an external impulse came in and prodded them, and they had to find some way to control it. So I think if we move away from thinking of fixed, rigid, rule-based structures and start understanding how we can deal with chaos, with genuine, I don't mean, as I say, the Sinofen idea, but with fractal mathematical chaos, where you can understand it to the extent that you can control it, that's the way that and that is beyond anything human beings are doing so far. I'd say if you want to go beyond things, that's where you want to try and aim for being able to control things like that.
So what would you then say is intuition? Because quite often when things go so badly wrong, our intuition helps us to make pretty good decisions.
Absolutely.
Sometimes not so good, but most of the times, good decisions.
So there is a condition associated with this, right? It is chaotic, but it's not chaotic in the sense in the other sense of the word, in that nothing is coordinated or in any way functional. And to me, it's about purpose. It's about every cell in that heart understanding that its job is to pump blood.
Right.
It is not to drive a car, right, or to walk up a stair. It is to pump blood. And I think the condition is that as people understand the purpose and their role in that, I think that enables that chaos to be effective. Now, the problem with control is there are two aspects to control that are problematic. One is that it is generally many controls are overreactions. Right. And anybody who has lived with anybody in an air-conditioned house will know this. Because the minute the temperature changes 1 degree, the other person will go and change the thermostat by at least 5 degrees to get it cooler or warmer. Right.
It's a sex-determined difference, definitely.
Right? So there is many controls are overreactive. And the second thing is that many controls survive their usefulness.
Oh, definitely.
And
then they just become the old cargo cult thing. Yeah. And right, like exactly. the door closing button in the lift, they're just to make you feel good.
Right. No, exactly. And,
that's a good one.
when we were busy putting the cloud book together, one of the authors said, from one of the cloud service providers said, one of the biggest issues we have is people tell us we need to be compliant. And to be compliant, we need to have these things in place. And when you look at those things, they have absolutely nothing to do with the compliance. But somewhere, 5 or 10 years ago, something happened in the organization and somebody put a rule in place, which has absolutely no relevance on anything that's currently happening in the organization, but there it is. And the other way in which I've seen this is when you end up with something which I don't know what the right name is, but it's stratified strategy. Basically, what happens is applications are developed 20 years ago to do something in an organization. Those applications are still around. And the strategy to manage those applications and to use those applications is exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. But on top of that, a new business need occurred, and it took a different architecture and a different way of making decisions and a different way of being governed. And that strategy was layered on top of the other one. Over 20 years, you now have 5 or 6 stratified layers of strategy, and none of them are coordinated. And so
a good example is the South African Police Service, where they tried to make it liberal and looking after people and a properly social orientated police force, and they succeeded in that. So sometimes the South African police force will go out and they'll meet people in the street and they'll help them out and they'll do all the good stuff, and the next day they'll be out with a shambox attacking them because the old system is there as well. And it's the two systems are coexisting at the same system. I think it's a great example.
Right.
But you're right, David. Sorry.
And the problem comes when you have, one group of people who has to support 5 different ways of thinking, 5 different methods of operating or operating models, 5 different, decision-making criteria.
We came up with that analogy, David, with the whole you can't, checkers board and a chessboard look the same, but you can't expect to play both games simultaneously on it. And that's what the problem with operating models is. Because they try and do different operating models and they try and use the same resources to run 2. People just don't understand the operating model aspect of it. And it's a good point, David.
Yeah. So so back to your point, Peter, to me, the chaos, the regulating or the governing factor in chaos is purpose. It's about everybody understanding their role.
I think it's the customer.
Well,
I think it's that flow of virtue which covers both. It's taking the what you're trying to do, and it's taking what you're trying to do it for, and making sure, as you say, all the blood vessels know what they're doing, and what you're doing is not saying you must do this or you must do this, but this is what we do because it is a virtuous thing to do. And if that is imbued in you, then when the signal comes, we need to move here or there, you move with that virtue as part of what you're doing.
And if we don't do it, we'll die.
Yes. So, guys, we're up to an hour. So I'm gonna try and summarize and then give each one of you a minute to respond. I like the virtue thing, but maybe we can call it purpose and the associated causes and names that we can cascade down the organization. It's definitely, it needs to consider value. We have to start understanding that we can't layer good behavior on bad behavior and then expecting it to work, even though when we created the bad behavior, it was good, which quite often happens. And I think organizations need to, I think they've started to understand that strategy is a continual activity. It is not an event. We just now need to do that in terms of updating our business model also. So whenever we make a decision,
everything has to follow.
There should be this point to say, okay, so what is the consequences of this decision, and how do we need to change? Instead of how we're going to change them. Yeah. So that was my two bits worth. So let's go clockwise. Richard, a minute.
A minute to win it. I think my closing point is transcending best practice. It's really about getting right in front of a customer, because the more closer you get to the customer, the less reliant you're gonna. You're not gonna drive a car through a driver's book. It's the same concept. You can go and read a best practice book, put yourself in front of a customer who's actually using a service. Your books aren't going to help you. You need to start using your intuition and your feedback from your customer and managing that and learning from that experience. But yes, the learning path towards getting there is going to require best practice, but getting right up as close as you can to a customer. If you're at the bottom of an organization, look at ways you can just engage more with customers, understand the services they're consuming. Unfortunately, there will be a lot of levels to go through for some, but ultimately, I think it's a principle thing again. It might never be perfect, but the closer you can get yourself and your teams to a customer, the more you're going to transcend naturally the need for best practice.
Okay, your minute is up, brother.
Oh, it's just finished.
Peter.
Oh, okay. I don't think I'll need a minute, and I won't go over what I said before or summarize it. What I'll try and do is just answer a question that you asked, Johan, and Richard, you alluded to, which is how come it is that our intuition works so well? And it is a very perverse and surprising thing that even in very odd situations, our intuition works well. Well, I would say, I mean, there are a number of answers to this, but my answer in the context of what we're talking about is our intuition works well because our brains are also fractal and they work chaotically. And when something comes in as an unknown impulse, it disturbs all sorts of different parts of the brain. And in a fractal way, they operate together and out comes an intuition that is new and different. And I think it's another tribute to the value of thinking, understanding fractals and how understanding them can help us in future to have control without controls.
Basically, you're suggesting that everybody is disturbed as well by what you're saying.
Well, yes, in a way, yes.
But Peter also said that it's all chemical. Yeah, David.
So for me, best practice, it should never be discarded out of hand. Best practice is based on lessons learned. If you understand what the lessons are that you have learned in the past, you will be able to understand which of those lessons are important for you for the future. It is not to slavishly apply what has been done in the past. It is to learn from what has been done in the past. And that, for me, is the value of best practice. And I wish we would change the name from best practice to great lessons learned.
Yeah, I love that. Great lessons learned.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Love it. Thank you, gentlemen. This was wonderful. I don't think it's finished still.
No.
Richard, it's all your fault.
No, that had nothing to do with
it. you started it all. So just lastly, everybody out there, hope you have a wonderful festive season, a safe one.
Absolutely.
You enjoy it with your family, and that the new year brings promise that we just cannot imagine. Stay well, stay safe, stay awesome.
Yep.
Cheers,
all the
everyone.
best. Thank you. That
from
was
these
great.
four middle-aged men.